If you have your Bibles, let's turn together to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to take the last half of this chapter this morning. Last week we left off with Paul, who found himself in defense mode. He had apparently come under criticism by the Corinthian church as not having any real authority over them, and they were using a pretty lame excuse for why they were unwilling to recognize Paul's continued authority over the church, and that was that he wasn't a recipient of any patronage or material benefits from the church. And to them, to the church, that was an indicator that they didn't really have to listen to him, right? That if Paul was somebody that was actually worth listening to, then he wouldn't have been spending his days making tents, right? Doing work and labor with his hands to support his own needs, right? The kinds of people that really had something to contribute from an intellectual or wisdom standpoint, where they were sponsored, they were supported by the various groups that wanted to hear and benefit from whatever wisdom they had to share. And Paul, he chose, and part of his defense comes in, not that he wasn't deserving of the support of the church. He just made the conscious and selfless decision not to receive that support so as not to hinder the advancement of the gospel. And so we pick up in verse 16 here. And today I want for us to kind of imagine what it's like for our lives to be so disrupted by Jesus, so interfered with, so messed with by God, by our Lord Jesus, that we find ourselves under a compulsion that is not derived in our own psyche or really doesn't even originate within ourselves, but that really is a credit to how God has gotten a hold of us as people. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, Paul says, "For if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast because I am compelled to preach." There it is. I'm compelled to preach. Right? If I preach the gospel, that is, if this thing that he is reminding the Corinthian church, he has been commissioned by Jesus to do. He says, if I do this, I don't have any reason to brag. I don't have any reason to boast because I'm compelled to do it. And we'll talk about what that means. And then he brings it to another level when he says, "And woe to me if I do not preach the gospel," right? I'm compelled to preach, and far be it from me not to preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, that is, if I take this charge voluntarily, then I have a reward. In other words, Paul's just simply telling us what we all know, and that is that when you and I, by our own choice, decide to take on a job or a career, we have a reward for that. We expect to, and rightfully, to be compensated for whatever that job is, right? That's what he means for if I do this willingly, if I do this of my own. But if I do it unwillingly, that is, if I am doing it for some other reason other than I have particularly chosen to do this, then I'm entrusted with a commission. We'll come back and talk about a little what that means. And then he asks this question, what then is my reward? And he answers it, to preach the gospel and offer it free of charge and not make full use of my rights in the gospel. So Paul says here, for if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast because I'm compelled to preach, and woe to me if I preach not the gospel. And so Paul is telling us right here at the beginning, he doesn't deserve credit. Paul probably could have been the recipient of all kinds of credit. Now, as we've talked about from time to time, the relationship that he has with the Corinthian church in particular appears to be quite strained, but that was not always the case. There were probably in the earliest of days in the Corinthian church and elsewhere, as Paul goes from place to place, there's probably a lot of accolade that Paul receives for the way in which God is using him, right? And those of you who have reached a point of excellence in your particular field or expertise in your particular field, or maybe you have, by account of your experience in your education or, your skill set that's developed over time, you've come into positions of authority over others, right? And you're involved in something where from time to time there's merit, there's applause for what you have done, for what you have accomplished. Paul was kind of in a position to have that happen for him a lot, right? And certainly the incredible way that God was using his life, in much the same way that for some of you and me, God uses our lives, and we can find ourselves from time to time in a place where we get a lot of credit for all that we've done. And Paul says, I don't deserve any credit whatsoever for this life that I've been called to. And then he points to how he is compelled to preach. That's the language that he uses. He's compelled to do this. And a lot of times people, they read this and they, especially if you're a student in Bible school and you're just kind of itching, right, to get out there and save the world, right? Get up on a stage somewhere and behind a pulpit somewhere, and you're going to use your words to change everybody that's out there in the congregation, right? You'll find a lot of young preachers often, talking about the fire that's in their bones, and they just gotta get it out, right? That's why I preach for an hour every week, right? It's compelled. Like this wasn't what Paul's not doing. He's not saying, hey, I've just got this thing that's so like welled up in me as if it somehow originated in him. And how we can, some of us have experienced like what it means to really be drawn and attracted to something with our lives. And once we sort of get a hold of that thing, it's like we can't let it go. It really starts to kind of envelop our lives, and we give so much of our lives to it. And a lot of times that can be a really, really good thing, right? That can create a tremendous degree of ambition and energy for us to go and to get this thing done that we feel like needs to get done. But Paul's he's pointing far more to Jesus than, as being responsible for this compulsion that Paul is feeling in his life than as if it's something that Paul drummed up on his own. And that's really important when we, for us to kind of take the lesson of what it means for Jesus to really get a hold of our lives. So I don't want you to get lost on the fact that Paul's a preacher and that like the thing he's talking about is preaching, because then we can just kind of dismiss the lesson from Paul's life that may also apply to our lives, right? The reality is we should be able to see ourselves in there. Paul is talking about himself in particular, right? He says, I was called to preach, and I've got to preach. I'm under compulsion to preach. But what about those of us in the room that maybe are called to something different from preaching, right? Like the reality is most of us here are not going to find ourselves in a place where we are preaching or teaching groups of people. But we ought to see ourselves in Paul's story because, God doesn't really make a distinction between the importance of calling that we might assign to someone like a preacher or an apostle in Paul's case, and the calling that God may have on another person's life that has nothing to do whatsoever with preaching. I believe that, a part of the Protestant tradition is that there's no distinction between clergy and laity when it comes to the offices that we fulfill in our lives, the way that our lives are yielded to God as a vessel for him to use, right? That the work that I do is not any more important than the work that anybody else in this room does. Now, it's different, right? Like I may be involved or invested to a far higher degree in some spiritual work that may be a different sort than so many of you, but like the work that we are called to, the way that God has uniquely called every single one of us as his sons and daughters. There's no qualitative difference between a person that, in our minds, we kind of create this hierarchy between, the callings of those that do incredibly influential things, for instance, right? A lot of times in our society, we pay millions of dollars to people that are involved in highly influential capacities. And so there's a material reward for some that manage to ascend this rank in the social strata, but there's no qualitative difference between what that person does and what I won't say anything in particular, but like what we would often consider to be some of the more mundane and ordinary kinds of jobs that we do and the ways in which we live our lives. How many people have, at the end of their life, when everybody comes around and celebrates and memorializes a person that has passed on, and that person has just lived a long and steady and faithful and devoted and committed life that it wasn't exactly flashy, but that really made a difference in the lives of oftentimes his or her immediate family and closest acquaintances, and just really contributed something to this thing we call life. In those moments, oftentimes we reflect and we are appreciative of the contributions that those people made. But so don't get lost in the fact that Paul's preaching. We need to see ourselves kind of in Paul's story, because what is true for him is true for us, and that is that Jesus, at the end of the day, wants to have a hold of our lives in whatever regard he may be calling us. Something I see here in the way that Paul is communicating, this compulsion that he has to preach, is that our lives are designed for order. Our lives are designed for order. Now, when I say our lives are designed for order, I don't mean order in the way that you might think. Like, I don't mean that our lives are necessarily designed to be really, really strictly organized, which should make some of you glad, right? Because you hear about something like order, and you think organization, and you think, that's not me. No. When I'm talking about order, I'm talking about something different, not necessarily organized, right? When our lives are designed for order, this goes for the kind of person who's really predictable. How many of you are really predictable? Really? Okay. So what I have in the crowd here is the most spontaneous group of people. All right. It's predictable that you predictable people wouldn't have raised your hands at a question like that. How many of you you're spontaneous, free spirit, living moment by moment? Right? Usually you're a little braver too, but maybe not today. So it doesn't matter whether your disposition is one of very organized, right? You have your calendar, you follow the calendar. Anytime somebody tries to get you to stray from your calendar, it creates a lot of inner angst and turmoil in you, right? And then there's some of you that don't know what you're having for lunch this afternoon, right? And that's okay. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're kind of the free spirit or, let's just say, the not so free spirit. Our lives are designed for order. And by order, I mean something like what St. Augustine often taught when he talked about rightly ordered love. You see, Augustine knew that we as human beings, we love all kinds of things, right? We have the capacity for loving multiple things simultaneously. But what Augustine also saw and taught that we can learn a lot from today is that it is important for us as we are following Jesus to learn what it means to love things in the right order, right? That is, while I can love all kinds of things, some of which are eternally significant, and other things that really are meaningless, right? I love what? Predictable, right? Yeah, I love golf, right? That's a meaningless thing. Now it's meaningful to me, right? That's partly why I love it, but it's meaningless, right? And we all have things that range in eternal significance in our lives. And what's important is that we have those loves ordered properly. We love things in the right order. And so what Paul, through his language here, is expressing to us is that if he did not yield himself to what Jesus had compelled him to do, the way that Jesus got a hold of his life and drove him to the particular thing that he drove him to do, which in Paul's case happened to be apostleship and preaching. But again, don't let that get lost. Don't let yourself off the hook because you're not an apostle or a preacher. For any of us for whom Jesus has gotten a hold of our lives, Paul says, if I had not given myself, if I had not yielded myself to what this thing that I am compelled to do, Paul would have been guilty of a disordered life, right? Paul would have had this life that was out of order. Paul says, for if I do this willingly, that is, if I take on this responsibility as I go and I do it like a job, then I have a reward. I can expect to get paid. But if unwillingly, then I'm entrusted with the commission. And he recognizes that this calling is it's something that Jesus has entrusted to him, right? That it doesn't originate with Paul. It originates with God himself. And God gives it over to Paul as a steward. And it's now Paul's responsibility to manage this assignment that God has given him in a way that will ultimately bring honor and glory to the one that he's serving, right? Like that's the way Paul frames and sees his whole life, as he is a servant of Christ. He's a slave of Christ. That's his primary identification, right? He lives in the kingdom of Jesus, and as a citizen of King Jesus, he is a servant of King Jesus. And so now what Jesus has entrusted to him, it is Paul's responsibility to carry that out with all of his life. And so you and I here that are following Jesus, the same can be said of us. What is it that we have been entrusted with? What is it that God has given us custody of? What is it that ultimately we're going to be accountable for? Paul doesn't see this merely as a job for which he gets paid. The origin of his ambition was from the way that Jesus took a hold of him, right? Paul says, this isn't what I chose. Those of you who are familiar with Paul's life, it's not what Paul chose. Paul didn't choose this life. This was God's choice for me, he says. And so it's his work. And so what we find in Paul, and what I hope maybe will speak to some of us this morning, is that Paul was more compelled by a who than a what. We think about our deepest desires, our deepest yearnings, what it is that drives us the most. I pray that you and I find ourselves more and more and more and more being compelled not by a what, by a who. Who? By God, by Jesus, by the one that we profess to be serving with all of our hearts and lives. And then what the what is, like that follows in the proper order. The what becomes, instead of us becoming a slave to the what, whatever that thing happens to be, we start as a servant to the who. I serve God with all my heart, and then I become free. I become free to do whatever it is that God has ultimately commissioned me to do. I become free to allow what God is compelling me to do that to his honor and glory. So I just want to ask each of us this morning, has Jesus really gotten a hold of us? Like, ask yourself that question. Has Jesus really gotten a hold of me? This is a very different question from, because I can ask the question, I could say, are you a good person? Or are you a spiritual person? Or are you a religious person, right? A lot of times people think in those terms, like whether or not they are, a person of faith, a person that's spiritual, a person that's religious, a person that's good, right? Like for so many people, that's the objective that they're trying to reach, is to become a good person. And I'm not interested in whether or not you're a good person. What I'm interested in is Jesus gotten a hold of you. Has Jesus taken a hold of your life? You know, there's some people that are living this life without Jesus. And you may be one of them this morning. I expect that there are in the room those who are presently living without Jesus. I'm so thankful that you'd be here listening to a preacher kind of drone on about life with Jesus. And I hope that maybe as a result of our time together this morning and maybe in future times together, you'll consider actually giving your life to Jesus. But there are those that live without Jesus. Some of them live unhappily without Jesus. Now, you might be here this morning, you're living without Jesus, you're not really a follower of Jesus, and you're incredibly unhappy, right? Because your life is in disorder for one reason or another. I imagine that of the thousands of people that inhabit this area, many of them are living without Jesus and are very, very unhappily living without Jesus. You know, maybe they find themselves in a position where they just can't control the various outcomes of their lives, or they lack certain advantages, or maybe they've just been dealt a really hard deck in their lives, right? Like they just started off behind everybody else. And it just seems like the universe, as they would call it, keeps throwing them curveball after curveball, and they can never find a way to live this life happily. But there are also some people who are living without Jesus and seem to be living quite successfully and happily without Jesus. You know, and a lot of times I wonder how that's possible, right? I mean, part of my job, part of my whole life is committed to try to convince people that living without Jesus is a disaster, right? And from an eternal standpoint, it is. But that, you know, even living through this life, this physical, this temporal, this earthly life without Jesus is not nearly the kind of life that one could live with Jesus, right? And then, and then I hang out with people that are just loaded with money, traveling all over the world, purchasing whatever their heart's desire happens to be, so that constantly their happy feelings are engaged, and yet they do it without Jesus. And I've come to realize that when a person is without Jesus, it is quite possible to simulate a pretty convincing facsimile of a successful and happy life. You know, a clone of this happy and fulfilled life that we talk about being lived with Jesus. And the reason why this is possible is because, like, we have, many of us, again, if you're of any kind of privileged circumstances, then we have the opportunity for our desire and our will to move in the same direction, and that can simulate happiness. You know, we've been talking about, and Paul, again, I think is just reminding us of the realities of our desires and our will here. And when our desire and our will is moving in the same direction, that can look a lot like success. That can look a lot like happiness. In other words, if I have certain desires and I have the will and the means to fulfill those desires, and I can just constantly do that, right? Like there's a constant stream of desire that is constantly being fulfilled in real and present time, well, that can simulate a kind of happiness. Let me paint the picture a little bit. You know, imagine a high school student wants to establish themselves in a rewarding career, right? Which, when we talk about a rewarding career, we're probably talking about something that that person is interested in, or that it pays well, or hopefully both. Right? And so that student, they get out of high school and they maybe start an apprenticeship or go to vocational school or perhaps college, and then they enter into that career. And so even during the times where really hard work is required, the they leverage their force of will in the same direction as their desires, right? They want to do this thing, and so as they're wanting to do this thing, their will is kind of taking them in that same direction. And so while some of it may be hard to do, it becomes easier because they're accomplishing their desires. And then meanwhile, while that career desire and trajectory is happening, when it comes to matters of relationships, they will whatever their heart desires in that regard as well. Whether they're seeking a long-term relationship, they can go and they can find that, or if they want to seek a casual kind of no strings attached relationship, they can go after something like that. If they want no relationship at all, they can do that. If they get into a committed relationship with somebody and that relationship is making them happy, then they're free to stay. But if they're in a committed relationship with somebody and it starts to not make them happy, then they can walk away. Again, they're like whatever their hearts are desiring, their will is moving in the same direction. And then you add to that the aspiration for whatever career and the seeking of the kinds of relationships that suit you and your particular set of desires. You add into that some of the other desires that you have, whether it's for recreation or hobbies, for traveling, for entertainment, or getting bigger ticket items, or gaming, or partying, going out, whatever those things are that your heart wants. Again, you have the force of will to bring you and to ultimately fulfill those desires. And maybe, so that it's not all about you, right? Because up to this point, it kind of seems like your whole life is being lived out for you. So in order to make it not all about you, you throw in some feel-good stuff, some ways that you can maybe give back to your community. So you decide to coach a soccer team, or volunteer for the PTA, or serve the homeless, or just checking out your groceries, and the cashier asks you if you want to round up the change, and you're like, yeah, I'll do it, right? And you walk away just feeling like you've done, right? And so we ultimately allow for our will to accommodate whatever our desires are, right? They're moving in the same direction. And so we find ourselves not really having to do a whole lot that we don't want to do. But what this does is it gives us a simulation of happiness, of fulfillment. Because if we have all of these desires happening in our lives that are constantly being fulfilled, it gives us, first of all, it gives us the appearance of control, right? We feel like we're controlling the outcomes of our lives. We're ultimately able to kind of look very proudly of what we have done or where we have gone and say, I did this, right? And we fool ourselves into thinking that we have control over things that we don't have control over. Paul had a secret, though. Paul's secret was Jesus got a hold of me. And he says in another letter, he says, I take hold of Jesus with both arms. I lock in, I clutch him like I've never held on to anything before. And so while our desires and our will moving in the same direction can give us the appearance of control, right? Because those things that we are most holding on to just happen to match and mesh with the desires of our heart. I want to ask each of us this morning, like, what is it that you are clutching more tightly than Jesus? The other thing, that when our desires, this constant stream of desires that we have, are constantly being fulfilled in real time and present time, it can give us the appearance of meaning, right? It can give us the appearance of significance. There's lots and lots of people that have become successful as the world measures success, right? As they themselves would measure success, and feel like I have lived a life full of meaning. And yet there will come a point where they will find that was only an appearance of meaning, right? Solomon figured this out. Solomon, who wrote some of the wisest sayings of the Bible, he writes this book we call Ecclesiastes, right? That just looks at his life that was spent on everything that could possibly thrill a human being. He had more riches than he could spend, probably more women than he could ever have, more power than any of us could possibly imagine, and yet he comes to the end of his life feeling like his whole life was just chasing the wind and was meaningless. Because while all the time he was trying to get a hold of something that he could never quite get his hands around, what he needed most was for God to get a hold of him. Back to Paul's letter in verse 19, Paul says, "Although I am free from all and not anyone's slave, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I may, by every possible means, save some. Now, I do all this because of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings." Now, so Paul there, he just kind of describes the various ways in which God is using him, and ultimately what we need to understand from what Paul means here, that he has become all things to all people, is that Paul saw a life that was free from entanglements. Because he came to recognize that a life without entanglements gave him the freedom to live for others. That became Paul's reward. The reality that he wasn't all tangled up in the affairs of this life that had the control of his heart and his mind and his will and his devotion and his affection. No, what he had come to recognize is that Jesus had a hold of his life, and here he is holding back onto Jesus with all that he has. Which freedom from the entanglements. Listen, if you grab onto Jesus with both of your hands, guess what? You don't have any other hands to clutch and to grasp for the other things that are here today and gone tomorrow, that may simulate the feeling of happiness and fulfillment, but that ultimately is just a grasping after the wind. You and I need to be cautioned against entangling ourselves and hindering our ability to live out God's call. This is why we encourage people to try to live, when it comes to our finances, to live in a way that is modest and responsible. That is, like, let's learn to live within our means rather than racking up all kinds of debt. You know, the world in which we live, it affords us the opportunity to purchase what we want before we have the actual power to purchase that thing, right? All I've got to do is fill out a quick application, get my approval, and voila, line of credit, all ready for me to go. What is that doing? It's borrowing on the future. It's tangling me up in something that I don't even actually know I'm going to be able to honor. And that entanglement, along with all the other entanglements, because listen, like when we live according to the way of this world, the wisdom of this world, which says, you know, a certain amount of debt is perfectly okay and appropriate for all of us to accommodate in our lives, right? We get ourselves a car payment and then another car payment, and spend a little bit on the credit cards, and maybe a line of credit, and again, maybe to some degree it's manageable and we're able to make the payments, but what we also find ourselves or the situation we find ourselves in at some point is we're just, I'm just so tangled up in this mess, right? And so that's one way. Or, bad relationships that we allow to ultimately become a hindrance to the way God wants to unleash us into the life that he has for us. And so we need a life without entanglements. We often ask ourselves the question, how can I become more free for myself? Right? How many of you are desperately looking to find more time for the things that you love? Anybody willing to admit to that? Right? All those things that you and I love, we want to find more time to free ourselves up for, right? That's a question we often ask. And listen, I mean, it's not It's not a terrible question for us to ask. But I wonder, what would it look like if we became less concerned with how do I free myself up more for myself? What if I asked instead the question, how do I become more free to others? How do I get my life into a position where I become more free to others, like Paul talked about? He said, right, and he lists every kind of category of people that he could possibly think of, right? To this person I became that, to this person I became that. Ultimately, as a slave, as a servant of Jesus, Paul became a servant to all. And believe it or not, that's a life that every single one of us is called to, every one of us. Whether or not you ever preach a sermon, whether or not you ever teach a Bible study, whether or not you ever do something that, a lot of times is kind of looked at as, spiritual work, like chasing this guy around. Brittany, I love the timing of that because a life that Jesus has gotten a hold of is going to find just how disruptive Jesus wants to be in our lives. If you're a follower of Jesus, I don't know if I call it bad news, but maybe some troubling news. That Jesus wants to disrupt our lives because he is disruptive. And so I ask each of us, what adjustments have we made in our lives to accommodate what God is urging us to do or urging us to become? How is it that Jesus may be pulling on our lives right now? A couple weeks ago, I got a email from an old friend, somebody that used to work for me, who had a very, very successful career. She kind of went on to do some other things. And she sends me this email and she says, hey, I just want to let you know I'm no longer at this company. And in fact, next week I am heading to the Ukraine to work in an orphanage. It's like, I don't know how long I'm going to be there because of the war, but she's just abandoned. Like, everything that she knows and is familiar and comfortable with for what she believes God is calling her to do. And listen, the radical nature of that kind of disruption may not be like the kind of thing that you and I are looking for. That does not mean in any way whatsoever that Jesus doesn't want to be incredibly disruptive to your life and to mine. Incredibly disruptive. So how do I become more free to others? Paul closes out this chapter, and we'll close our time together this morning by reading these last few verses. Don't you know that the runners in a stadium all race, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way to win the prize. Paul describes the life lived with Jesus is one that deserves the kind of pursuit that the person, right, when you, whatever the athletic accomplishment happens to be, pick your favorite sport or whatever, and like the person that has risen to the very highest level of accomplishment in that sport, that has received the highest level of award for that particular endeavor. Think about what they did, how they poured their life into getting themselves to that position. Paul says the life lived with Jesus, it deserves that. That's what it deserves. It doesn't deserve our haphazardness. It doesn't deserve our so-so kind of commitment. It deserves everything. Run in such a way to win the prize. Now, everyone who competes exercises self-control in everything. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. Now Paul contrasts between the reward that athlete receives, one that just really, at the end of the day, doesn't mean a whole lot. And yet, the kind of reward that we are going after means so much more. We endeavor to receive an imperishable crown. So I do not run like the one who runs aimlessly or box like one beating in the air. Instead, I discipline my body and I bring it under strict control so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified. Would you stand with me this morning? As we close out our time together, I hope that there's maybe something upon which we can reflect and kind of take to heart, take into our hearts. I hope that we'll walk away with a question that's just kind of stirring in us. God, how is it that you want to disrupt me? How is it that you want to disorient me? God, I have tried to simulate control over so many areas and aspects of my life, but what is it that you want to do? I said our lives were designed for order. Guess what? The degree to which we pursue a life followed with Jesus, that life could look like utter chaos. Right? To the outsider, to the person outside of our lives, they'd be bewildered at what to them looks like the chaos and the storm of our lives, because like walking with Jesus it's a ride. It really is. And I'm not saying this as one that like stands as a shining example of what that even means. Listen, I am far more preaching to any of you this morning. I am preaching to this guy. I'll be the first to tell you, I'm pretty comfortable. I love what Conrad's son Nathan now said in the video there when he talked about, going to Uganda and checking out what's happening at the facility there. He talked about the fact that if you go, it's going to give you the opportunity to feel uncomfortable. And some of you, when you heard that, you're like, good to know. Now I don't have to go to the Global Outreach Interest meeting. And yet, discomfort, our getting dislodged from these comfortable and insulated lives, I think is exactly what the doctor has ordered for each of us. And that's going to look differently from person to person. I pray God will disrupt our lives, that we will welcome the disruption that Jesus wants to be in each of us.